Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for signing on to this webinar. We're going to wait one more minute here, let a few more people sign on. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, Michael Segala here, housing and transportation consultant here in the Clovis, Fresno area. This is the monthly webinar, the San Joaquin Valley REAP program. As you know, many of you have tuned in before. We do these every month, and we've had a very successful run. Next month was supposed to be our last webinar, but we're going to go ahead and continue it with new subjects every other month moving forward. Many of you are from jurisdictions. Your housing elements are due at the end of 2023 or the beginning of 2024. So everyone's getting really busy. There's obviously a big new component to these, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that's the topic of the webinar today. A few house rules, and I'll introduce the panelists. Let's see. First one is we'll generally take questions at the end. We have two presenters today, and so there's 3 different ways to ask a question. You can use the question and answer feature, the chat feature, or you can raise your hand, and Robert and I will scan those and call on you appropriately. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour from 1 to 2 today. It is eligible for AICP CM credit, and I will in the chat function send you the course number for that. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the San Joaquin Valley REAP workshop webpage in a couple days after this event today. So let me first introduce my co-host here, Robert Phipps from Fresno COGS, who's managing the San Joaquin Valley REAP effort. Robert, go ahead and say a few words.
Yeah, just good afternoon and thank you for joining.
Anything else on the REAP program that people need to know about?
Just that good news. It looks like for those of you who are familiar with REAP, it looks like we have an agreement to extend the deadline for expenditures for another year approximately, which means that we now have until 2024 to get all invoicing in and wrap up the entire program. That does still have to be signed by the governor, so it's not a sure thing, but we understand that should come in short order. So we're very pleased to hear about that.
Yep, very good. And as a reminder, about two-thirds of the 19 million that came to the San Joaquin Valley in REAP funds is supposed to be suballocated to jurisdictions, primarily for housing element support. So don't wait too long and reach out to your COG representative and they can inform you better. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce the first panelist, Lucy Rollins from PlaceWorks. Go ahead and say hello and a few things about you, then we'll introduce the next panelist, Lucy.
Great, thank you, Michael. My name is Lucy Rollins. I'm an associate planner at PlaceWorks, and fair housing is really my wheelhouse. During the 6th cycle, which is a different beast than previous cycles, I worked on over 20 housing elements. And in addition to that, I've written over 30 assessments of fair housing. So got my feet wet in it and know what we've gone through from the beginning to now. So I'm hoping to share some of that with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Veronica Tam.
Veronica Tam with Veronica Tam Associates. I'm a housing consultant, principal at the company. We do a lot of housing element work, certainly a lot. I stopped counting after 100, so I don't know how many I've done in the past. But in this 6th cycle, I think the most challenging is definitely, like Lucy mentioned, is the assessment of fair housing. We've Besides housing element work, we do analysis of impediments to fair housing choice and assessment of fair housing for local jurisdictions. And so as part of that, we kind of brought in that kind of understanding of what the requirements into the AFFH analysis. This certainly has become one of the most critical components of the housing element. And having worked on a lot of housing elements in Southern California now, we're kind of getting an idea about what STD is looking for, and we'll be sharing that with you today.
Very good, thank you. So very good. We have two great experts that will help us out in this new area of housing elements. So we're going to start with Lucy, and both of our panelists have a slide deck, and they're going to spend some time going through this. So go ahead, Lucy.
Great, thank you. Let me share this. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an overview of the AB 686 requirements. So just for some background, Veronica will go into more of it, is that this does expand on the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and we dive further in. AB 686 defines affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, that's a term you'll see floating around all the time, as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcomes patterns of segregation and fosters inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. And I read that verbatim because it's really important. All of those key phrases that come out of that really go into every aspect of the assessment, and you'll see them pop up all the time. As part of the background of AB 686, it requires more deliberate action for the programs in your housing element, as well as your outreach activities, and includes several new requirements. So the AB 686 results in this assessment of fair housing that is like an analysis of impediments, but now everyone that has a housing element is required to do it. The required sections of the fair housing section, or the AFH as we call it, is outreach, assessment of fair housing issues, and then there are 4 or 5 categories in there depending on how you split it up, and I'll dive into those further. Enforcement and outreach capacity, and this differs from just the outreach section because one is a summary and the other is looking at how you as a jurisdiction conduct your outreach to your community. The sites inventory analysis, and then contributing factors, which really summarizes all of your findings from the assessment and links them to your programs in your housing element. As you're doing this analysis, some of the big components you have to focus on, you start with an analysis of the current conditions in your jurisdiction. Then you compare that to historic trends. There are some challenges with that. Veronica will dive into those, particularly associated with data. And then you do a comparison of your jurisdiction to the region. So that could be the county, the COG level. And based on all of that information, you identify programs. And then after the housing element, you implement them, evaluate them. And then our understanding right now is the 7th cycle, you will start it all over again. So the fair housing issues, these are a major component of the AFH. So there are 4 categories. You can split up that third one into into 2 if you would like. But the first one is the patterns of integration and segregation. And within this analysis, you assess income distribution. So poverty rates, median incomes, are there any concentrations within your jurisdiction? Racial and ethnic characteristics. So as part of this, you're going to look at racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, as well as racially concentrated areas of affluence. So that's particularly important for jurisdictions that might have higher median incomes than the areas around them. That is a great thing for your residents, but it can also pose a barrier such as exclusivity based on higher home values, things like that. So HCD wants you to analyze those as well. Disability rates, some disability is normal, but if we have a concentration of disability rates of high disability, that may be an indicator of senior housing. It may be an indicator of discrimination based on disability. So depending on what you find there, you'll dive in further. And then familial status, particularly for female-headed single-parent households as a protected class. So next is access to opportunity. This, you're going to look at environmental health. So Cal EnviroScreen comes in big for this one. Transit mobility. So is there transit available in your jurisdiction, in your region? How can people get to it? What are access points like? Employment opportunities. So where are your commercial centers? Where are your jobs located and how many? What's your job housing ratio? Educational opportunities. Are there schools throughout your jurisdiction and what is the quality of them? And then services for persons with disabilities. So that links into the transit, but also residential care facilities and other components as well. Next, we look at disproportionate housing need and displacement risk. So this is particularly for lower income households. Are they experiencing greater issues than other households? So we look at rates of overcrowding, which could be as a result of multi-generational housing, doubling up, student housing, things like that. Overpayment for both renters versus owners, homelessness. And the big piece of this over the last couple of months, HCD has come out with is they want you to take that comparison and look at the protected characteristics of your homeless population and compare that to your jurisdiction's population as well. There are a lot of challenges related to this, depending on what the data that comes out of your point in time survey actually reports. Look at substandard housing conditions, and then displacement risk is this umbrella that can go into its own section as well. This is things like vacancy rates, the rise in home prices versus wage increases, things like that. And then we have this final bucket category that HCD wants you to review under AB 686. And that includes local knowledge. So that is anything feedback you received from the public, stakeholders, people like that. Your experience as a jurisdiction with exclusionary practices historically, currently if they happen. Investment patterns. So your capital improvement program comes into play here. How are you investing money? Is there a prioritization of where money is invested? How projects are picked during each update? Items like that. Land use and zoning. It's no surprise that single family zoning is known to be a barrier to fair housing. So how does that come to play in your jurisdiction? And then access to funding, lending, things like that. Then we have our sites and our programs. First, we have our enforcement and outreach. As I mentioned, that's going to be your compliance with fair housing laws. There's a whole slew of them that HCD identifies in their memo. Fair housing provider feedback. It's really important to talk to your local fair housing provider to meet AB 686 requirements. And then your outreach accessibility. Do you offer translation? How do you conduct your meetings? Things like that. When you have your sites inventory, you're going to look at it through an AFFH lens. So where are the sites located? How are the income groups distributed? How will they impact existing patterns within your neighborhoods? And what are the pros and cons of all of that? So you're going to analyze the magnitude of your sites inventory. So what proportion of each unit type falls into each neighborhood or meets each indicator in your analysis. And then finally, once you've done all that, you determine your contributing factors. So you start by looking through your assessment and identifying what are your major fair housing issues. Do you have displacement risk? Are there concentrations of poverty? Are there high home prices that are excluding some residents? Next, you look at what factors might contribute to that. Do you have a shortage of affordable housing? Do you have a lot of single family housing? What may be going on? Third, you look at what programs do you have currently that might address this with some tweaking? And then where are there gaps? So what new programs do you need? And then one of the biggest components of affirmatively furthering fair housing is making sure your actions are meaningful. So making sure that the language of fair housing comes up in all of your programs, your metrics. So making sure you have timelines for making sure the programs happen on schedule, that they're actually going to accomplish something. You have an objective that comes out of them. In our experience, there's been a lot that comes out of all of these. They are a hold up in the housing element. They're a really large component of the entire document now. So a few things we've learned are your program should be very specific. As I just mentioned, you need to answer how, when, and to what extent the program will accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Even high resource areas are subject to scrutiny. We've had jurisdictions that are entirely designated as highest resource areas. And HCD wants to know, what does that mean as a barrier for other residents or people that might be seeking to live in your community, or you have jobs that your employees can't work in your jurisdiction. So just because your jurisdiction might be highest resource or have high resource, that's still an area worth consideration. One of the most valuable resources I've encountered is fair housing providers, local historians, librarians. They have a wealth of knowledge, particularly for your other relevant factors. So tap into those organizations within your community. Conduct a fair housing workshop and/or a survey to get the feedback of your residents, and make sure that's incorporated throughout the assessment. So don't just dabble it in at the beginning and end, but actually use that to inform your assessment. And then every single jurisdiction is different. HCD does have comments that are sort of cookie cutter. We see come up all the time across jurisdictions, but they do look at each jurisdiction uniquely to see what's going on, what policies you have. So make sure that you're focusing on what's your community, not just this standard approach. So that's sort of my overview, and Veronica has a lot more nitty gritty for you to get into. Michael, I don't know if you want to do programs or just dive into Veronica's now.
Let's go
Or
ahead.
sorry, questions.
Let's take a pause. That was a lot of information already. Anybody have any quick questions that won't derail the webinar for a long time? Let's see. Doesn't look like there's any questions. Let's roll on to Veronica. Go ahead.
Overlaps between Lucy and my presentation, so I'm going to try to skip over those. Are you seeing my presentation now or no? Not yet. Okay, great. So I'm going to skip over some of the topics that Lucy has already covered, like the basis of the affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that it is taking the now repealed federal regulation and putting it in the housing element and having a very extensive guidance from HCD in preparing the AFFH analysis. What makes it very difficult, particularly for the AFFH for small jurisdictions, is the data challenge. Because the framework of the analysis and the requirements came from the federal AFFH rule, which applies only for jurisdictions that are population 50,000 or above, or urban county program that has 200,000 population above. So when you're a local jurisdiction, when this is being adopted by reference into the housing element law, it now applies to jurisdictions no matter how small you are. The smaller you are, the more challenging you are going to have to experience in terms of getting the AFFH analysis. For one thing, if you're a local jurisdiction, if you're an entitlement jurisdiction, you typically would hire a fair housing service provider to provide services, and so you have records of your fair housing issues in your community. But if you're a small jurisdiction, you participate in the county's CDBG program, typically the county's contract does not require the service provider to break out statistics for local jurisdictions. So I would have one recommendation. If you have the ability to talk to your county CDBG lead to require or add in a scope of work to ask your CDBG fair housing service providers to start collecting fair housing records by jurisdiction and providing that at the year-end report so that you have some statistics to report. In Southern California, when we go through this and get the urban county program, it's very difficult to explain to HCD that we have no data. And so I think at this time, you still have a shot in getting some fair housing records locally. Try to petition with your CDBG lead to get that. The regional AI, if there is one, try to glean anything from it that may be useful. But however, the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice has a very different bend compared to the housing element law. You may be able to use it for some regional context, but you may not be able to, you should not be able to rely on it entirely and fulfill the housing element requirement. And if you're an unincorporated jurisdiction, that presents another difficulty because a lot of the data, particularly from HUD, is not break out by the unincorporated jurisdictions. So that is going to be a challenge for county housing element, getting that data just for the unincorporated jurisdictions. Lucy mentioned about the AFFH analysis structure. We structured it a little bit differently. But it's essentially covered the same type of topic, so I'm not going to go into details on some of these, but I would go into, like, I would make a couple of comments about each topic that maybe Lucy has not covered. For the fair housing outreach, in the past, when you write the housing element in your 4th cycle, 5th cycle housing element, all you have to say is that you refer fair housing inquiries to the fair housing service providers. That is not going to be an acceptable response to fair housing issues in your community in the housing element. You must proactively initiate your own outreach and education about fair housing, because it's not just about people who are participating in the HUD programs. If you have newsletters, if you have some other kind of social media, utilize that to do your fair housing outreach and education. The other thing too, Lucy talked about, if you are an affluent community, and that's more challenging too, especially if you're affluent, if you're homogeneous in terms of population, your outreach and about housing opportunities in your community needs to go beyond your city limits. Because if you continue to outreach to your own residents, to people who already live in your community, you're not doing anything to diversify your population. You're not increasing mobility within the region and within your jurisdiction and inviting other people to come. So when you do your outreach about housing opportunities in your city, when you do outreach about your housing element, you need to go beyond your city limit. I usually recommend going to the school district boundaries. If the school districts cover more than one jurisdiction, that would be the best. At least you are incorporating you're inviting people who are located at least locally or close by to access housing opportunities in your community. Integration and segregation patterns and trends, these are things that Lucy covered, so I'm not going to go into the details about it. Also, we talked about racial and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and racially concentrated areas of affluence. These are, again, very important, especially if you're an affluent community. HCD is going to ask you, well, we're 95% white, or we are 70% above moderate income. HCD's response is exactly what are you going to do to outreach to the 5% non-white and the 20% that are low income. And so that's what you need to do above and beyond to reach to the limited, the population that are considered to be disadvantaged. I think that is the most important. If you're going to have an EJ element, trying to incorporate your or coordinate your outreach activities that you're required to conduct as part of your EJ element, that would actually have a lot of synergy there that you can coordinate. Disparities in access to opportunities. Again, Lucy talked a little bit more about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I think in some cases, what we've been in one community, education becomes a very important, the most difficult challenge that we have to overcome with the siting of housing units, because we're converting industrial uses into housing. The question then becomes, how are you going to make those industrial areas to become neighborhoods? What are the amenities, opportunities, services that you're going to be putting in these areas when you're converting non-residential uses into residential uses? How do you make it into a neighborhood, not just dropping a housing site, number of housing units in a location? Disproportionate needs, cost burden, overcrowding, displacement. Displacement is definitely something that you need to look at. There are sources out there that looks at displacement in different communities. You may want to look at displacement risk in addition to what's available on the HCD's website. All of these needs to be informed by local knowledge. We can provide, you can write about statistics, but it doesn't explain to the public or to HCD why the certain patterns and occur in the community. That's where local knowledge kind of comes in to supplement the data. One thing that they always ask for is lending data. It may not be easy to access, but the FFIEC site does have what's called Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, you can get HMDA data from FFIEC sites to talk about lending practices in your city. What kind of public comments you have received? How do they inform the fair housing picture in your community? Segregation, RE caps, and all of that. How did that happen? What are the historical trends or policies or even historical events that led to this kind of segregation? And I think Lucy mentioned that, like going to your local historical society, and that's what we end up having to do with some communities, because nobody has worked in a city long enough to know why certain things happen, but the historical society may have some historical kind of context to it. Code enforcement activities and environmental justice, climate actions, all of these can kind of feed into your AFFH analysis or your response to AFFH issues. Meaningful actions, HCD does look at how your housing element. You have to have meaningful actions in these 5 specific buckets: housing outreach, mobility, place-based strategy for neighborhood improvements. Place-based is particularly important if you're converting a lot of non-residential uses into residential uses. If you're putting a lot of housing units in lower income neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods, what are the things, what are the concentrated or coordinated strategies that you are going to implement in order to support the housing that you're putting in there? Like I mentioned before, in one jurisdiction, we're converting an industrial area into housing. So we have to explain the whole ideas about complete streets, safe out to schools, the bus transit that connects the different schools, and the inter-school transfer policies. We have to explain a lot of that to kind of explain how residents can be provided educational services in a currently primarily industrial area. Anti-displacement, tenant protection, you would see all of that even without the AFFH the requirements right now. Tenant protection is one of the biggest topic that your advocates are going to demand. So what are you as a local jurisdiction ready to or be able to address in terms of tenant protection? New opportunities in high resource areas, like how are you going to, SB9, ADUs, those are some of the strategies that you can do. When you do your analysis, HCD wants to look at geographic references, like where are how are your sites distributed by these AFFH factors, like concentration of minority, where the population of disabilities, like familial status, how are they concentrated in terms of low and moderate income population? What about by TCAC allocation? So you pretty much have to hit these factors when you look at your distribution of the RENA sites. How are they being distributed? And so typically we do some analysis like that. This is City of Long Beach. And this is like distribution of the RENA sites by the TCAC allocation, the resource allocation category: highest resource, high resource, moderate, and then all the way to high segregation and poverty. And as you can tell from this particular map, there is a very distinct east-west divide in the City of Long Beach. East side is primarily single family. West side is primarily multi-family. Needless to say, a lot of our sites are in the west side, which becomes an issue. What do we have to do? What do we have to promise to do in the housing element to move more housing into the east side? So there are programs to actually put more housing, to rezone even with even though we didn't need to rezone it, we will be rezoning more properties in the east side to equalize the disparity. But typically we do this kind of mapping and then tables to kind of look at the distribution of the sites by income category. Then there's another level of geographic reference. When you talk about, housing element, we have 40% of our sites is in the, 30% of our sites are in the low resource area. If you just read the text, HCD would have no idea, well, what does that mean with the low resource areas? So we usually now throw in an additional layer, divide the local jurisdiction into neighborhoods. So that neighborhoods that people can understand, that your residents know, okay, this is area 1 is this neighborhood, area 2 is that neighborhood. Then we look at the site's inventory and looked at it by the different areas, and then the distribution of the AFFH factors, the distribution of the site capacity, so that if you're a resident in one area, you know how you compare to other jurisdictions. So the table actually looks more like that. I think this is from the city of Berkeley. But this is how HCD is looking to see in the housing element these days, to also have some kind of neighborhood or sub-area analysis, so that they can see whether you are putting more housing that in one particular neighborhood compared to another. And then the last slide that I want to just cover, and this is again something kind of newer that HCD is looking for, how you should write about your programs, your action areas, like the themes that we talked about, and what program they are, what are the specific commitments, what's the timeline, whether you have any geographic targeting. So if you're going to implement an action and every action is citywide, then it's not going to be acceptable to HCD. If you continue to do what you've been doing in exactly the same way citywide, you're not doing anything at all to actually move the dial. You're not doing anything to bridge the disparities that are currently existing in your community. You must do above and beyond what you normally do, and target it with targeted efforts in certain neighborhoods, so that you can create a more level playing fields among the different neighborhoods. Metrics like outcomes, you can do outcomes based on theme, but you could also do it by program. So with that, I think that's my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Veronica. Okay, now I'm completely overwhelmed. So Lucy, can you put your sheet up, the overview, or Veronica, the overview of, like, how do I approach this if I'm a city staff? Give me the big picture again.
Let me throw that up.
And if I was city staff, I'd be looking for some graduate students looking to fulfill their thesis paper requirements and just hand them this assignment, because that's what it feels like to me. Is that what it feels like when you do it?
It's a big research assignment, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so those are the let's see, outreach side, enforcement. Where's the part about program analysis on the left-hand side, required analysis?
So for mine, that falls under the contributing factors, whereas Veronica had that called out as meaningful actions.
Okay, so
It's sort of the
factors
same.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
So you do all this analysis, you analyze your sites, you identify on your housing element, and then you figure out whether or not your city is meeting those requirements. Okay, so that's the big picture in terms of AFFH. Folks have any questions? Let's see, how does the jurisdiction determine substandard housing? I think somebody talked about this briefly.
So in our experience, so that's definitely one of the most challenging ones, especially in jurisdictions who haven't done a housing condition survey recently or have one on the docket for this housing element update. So obviously the easiest one would be to do a housing condition survey. You can base off of the age of your housing stock using rule of thumb that housing units over 30 years old typically require some sort of maintenance, whether it be small or like minor or major, but you have to pair that with local knowledge. So feedback from your code enforcement division based on violation claims or notices from your public. Like, what do you, if you conduct a survey, what do they say? We always ask in our surveys what people are experiencing for their homes, whether it's an ownership and rental unit. So there's a few different ways to do it, but based on what your commitment is, either doing a survey of the units themselves or basing it on public feedback, code enforcement feedback, things like that.
Okay. Let's see. Next, I'm going to ask questions. I don't see questions. Lots of outreach similar to the housing element outreach. They could be done concurrently, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And certainly for this particular round, given that this is a new requirement, it's very helpful that, we have both LEAP and REAP funds available. But going forward, we don't necessarily anticipate that, in future cycles. Are you aware of from a cost standpoint of what this would run to get it hired out, or how much this adds to a jurisdiction's expenses relative to, say, a fifth cycle housing element?
I'm not aware. Veronica, do you have any experience with that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? I'm not quite sure I understand how does that compare to the fifth cycle?
So the question is that AFFH is a new requirement, and this cycle we also have funding from REAP and presumably from LEAP, although some many jurisdictions have used their LEAP funds already for other purposes. Are you aware of any other programs out there that would help jurisdictions get this done? And also in terms of the expense, contracting it out, do you know what this adds to the cost of a housing element, say relative to the housing element update relative to the fifth cycle?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Robert. That is unfortunately probably the most expensive component of a lot of the housing elements these days. And I'm working on the Contra Costa Collaborative and the Marin County Collaborative, and a little bit work on ABAC as well. What they are doing is using the REAP fund to pay for that. But a lot of the outreach, they are utilizing the consultant for the REAP to develop materials, translated materials, videos that you can just post. HCD has a very good explanation of what is the housing element and why do you need to have the housing element. They provided a video that you can just link it to your housing element website or to play it, so that you don't have to be the one explaining about the housing element. So I think to the extent that you regionally can do it and share that, I think in Contra Costa County we also did a developers forum. So we interviewed developers who talk about market in the region. So if you do that, then everybody can take the responses from that result and utilize it for their housing element as well. But I think if you are a local jurisdiction, if you're doing your consolidated plan, your annual action plans, and that has some kind of outreach, you would want to kind of coordinate with that, and at least use that as part of your outreach to save some funding. But in general, it can be the most expensive, and I would say a lot of jurisdictions, their outreach is anywhere between $50,000 to $100,000. But when you're a small community, you don't have that. But at least what you need to do is to make sure that at a minimum, you have outreach to agencies and organizations that serve low-mark special needs. You identify which are the disadvantaged neighborhoods in your community and do extra to post flyers or utilize next doors or some other local churches to help you do the outreach. I don't think you need to necessarily have to do a very elaborate process, but on the other hand, you do have to hit the different protected classes under the fair housing laws. How do you reach the elderly? How do you reach the disabled? How do you reach the minority? And translation is definitely an issue. So that's another thing that you may want to coordinate for some kind of regional efforts to provide translated materials.
Mhm. Very good. Let's see. Talking to people, there's a couple of questions in the chat. We're going to get to those right now. But one point is, you mentioned getting historical information from the Historical Society. Former planning directors are a pretty good source of information in terms of what's happened in communities as well. So keep that in mind. And it seems like, if I could just make this comment, California's AFFH is really the federal's version of fair housing on steroids, if you will. So that's sort of the analogy I see in my head as it plays out. And if I was a city staff, given everything we talked about thus far, I'd want to know give me a couple cities that have done this and where can I see their reports so I can get my hands around this better. Are there any cities that pop out, panelists, that you would say, yeah, they did a great job on their AFFH and actually HCD reviewed and approved it rather simply?
In my experience, one of the most challenging parts of that is that the HD's review of the fair housing section has been evolving rapidly. So just because a housing element with a section was approved 6 months ago does not mean it's necessarily going to meet the standards of what they want to see today.
Right.
That being said, if you look at the most recently updated or most recently adopted and certified housing elements, that would be probably the best place to start for those types of resources.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, let's read a question from Elizabeth Harvey. Not sure if Lucy or Veronica mentioned this, but it was recommended to get data from CDBG on fair housing. I don't know if that was CDBG. Fair housing information, something of that nature. Can you repeat this information and share more?
I think that was me.
Yeah.
So usually because this was originally a federal requirement, under the federal rule, if in order to receive fair housing services, in order to receive CDBG funds, the entitlement jurisdiction has to have fair housing records. And so what happens then is if you are a county that CDBG entitlement that you are also you are also overseeing the CDBG program for small jurisdictions with less than 50,000 population, they go under the county program. The county goes about hiring a fair housing service provider to maintain fair housing records, provide fair housing services. But the fair housing records usually are reported under one entity, like the county. So there is no data that's broken down by the city of, I'm going to say the city of San Joaquin, the city of Kingsburg, these small cities, they're not going to have data from that contractor under the county to know any kind of fair housing issues within your local jurisdiction. So what I've been advocating for like Southern California is for those contractors to change the way they report. Obviously, they've been funded by the county to provide fair housing services for the small jurisdictions. They should have the ability to give you a report and say, in 2022, 22 people from the city of San Joaquin call Echo Housing for fair housing issues. And these are the topics that they asked about. So you should be able to ask for that kind of records. But because currently the contract that these certified fair housing service providers have with the county governments or the county jurisdictions do not require them to provide that level of detail. Usually, if you request it, they're still not going to have it because they're not collecting it that way. So you should advocate for your entitlement, your lead county jurisdictions to require their fair housing contractor to provide the jurisdictional level of data, so that when you write about your fair housing issues, then you have some records. You have something that local knowledge about what is happening in your jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, I'm gonna just back to your last question really quick. I'm going to put in the chat the link to where everyone can find the certified housing elements in case you don't have that handy and you want to reference it when it comes time for you. So I'll just shut this down and share that just as a heads up.
Yep, and also I linked the HCD guidebook for jurisdictions on AFFH, but HCD also has a whole webpage devoted to AFFH, so resources are there as well. Next question is from Mark Staples, panelist. He says housing element plus AFFH plus the EJ element. For those who haven't updated our general plans recently equals what? He wants to know what is it? What do you call that?
Well, I don't know, like housing element, you're required to update your housing element. You're required to update your safety element as well. But federal housing element laws, general plan law says that if you're updating more than two elements at the same time, I think two or more elements at the same time, you're also required to do an EJ element if you have. I think that's a requirement. So these are part of your general plan. It's not the update of the entire general plan, but you have to at least look into whether you need to do an EJ element. There are definitions of what kind of communities needs to do an EJ element. But if you're updating your housing element and safety element at the same time, you need to do an EJ element most likely.
Is there any recommendation to do the EJ element concurrently with AFFH? Is there any benefit to that?
There is certainly benefit, but we tried in some other jurisdiction with the EJ element, with the housing element. However, because the EJ element also have very different requirements, we end up in most cases that the EJ element is just not moving as fast as the housing element.
Okay, thank you. Another question was, in addition to examples of jurisdictions that have successfully navigated this new process, are there any examples in rural California where these practices have resulted in the desired housing construction?
I think it's still too early to know.
Okay.
I don't know, like we're just adopting the housing element, whether there'll be, and I'm going to be very honest too, though. In a lot of the rural areas, you're not going to see as big of a shift in terms of density and housing options as quickly as in some other communities, because land is available and a lot of times it's difficult to build high density in rural areas.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments from our audience?
My question is there, in your experience, have you seen one particular aspect of AFFH that has tripped up jurisdictions more than others and resulted in, there was a time I know when every jurisdiction was getting its housing element kicked back. I think that's been finally beaten. We had Placer, I think it was, right? That was the first one to go through without being rejected once, at least. Is there some aspect that seems to be the particular culprit there, or is it the process as a whole?
Within the fair housing section, or
Right. Right. Yeah, within AFFH.
We always get comments on the site's inventory analysis every
Okay.
time.
I think the difficulty is the meaningful action for
Mhm.
small jurisdictions, because you don't have the staff, you don't have the experience of doing a lot of these. And I'm writing a housing element for a community of 800, population 800. The AFFH analysis is still 100 pages. This it's, it's one sentence tract, but to go through the topic, it is that much. And then finding meaningful actions it's going to be interesting, because that city has one part-time planner who works 5 hours a week. And that's the only, like, who else is going to do things? And so that's going to be, I can write a lot of actions in it, but is that going to be, can it really be realistically done? So I think that is, the smaller you are, the more difficult you are, the more affluent you are, the more difficult that is going to be. The more homogeneous you are, the more difficult it is. So I think it's every jurisdictions have different issues. Like site inventory usually is an issue, but place-based strategies for neighborhood improvement, that's definitely a very big topic, because some communities have no choice but to put housing in the highest around transit, for example. But that's also usually where there's a high concentration of low and moderate income population and minority population. So there are conflicting kind of direction from the states. On the one hand, they want you to put it in high transit area where there is transit oriented development. On the other hand, they ask you, but why are you concentrating housing in that area? Then what are the neighborhood improvements that you're going to come in to supplement that? So I think that is also very difficult. I think one neighborhood, one housing element in the San Diego region, the majority of the housing has to be in the downtown area. That's the only area that they have. And they thought it makes sense in the past when they did the downtown specific plan and then put a lot of housing there. That's where transit is. That's where infrastructure is going to be available. But now they get stuck. You're putting all your housing in the downtown area. So I think if you have that kind of strategy, always think about other ways to look at it. SB 9, ADUs, moderating densities in some lower density neighborhoods. And those you may not be able to shift your RENA sites to a very even kind of distribution, but at least you are moving the dial. I think HCD wants you to move the dial.
Very good answer. Thank you. I think we have a couple more questions. What are some examples of notable programs that result from AFFH analysis?
It varies by jurisdiction significantly. Some of the examples I've come up with we've found are promoting access to transit and other resources. So less on the housing side of it, or it feels like it's less on the housing side, but making sure that your housing is located near those services. And if they're not, how to bring those services to the housing, as well as rehabilitation. So identifying a need and making sure that one of the biggest issues we encounter is communication of resources that are available to residents. So residents are unaware of whether it be fair housing related, or they're unaware of financing options or things like that. So outreach programs, as sort of Veronica went over, is one of the largest programs challenges that we encounter.
Right. I do feel other things too, like for example, because I do fair housing analysis normally outside of housing element, one of the things that I always advocate, a couple of things I always advocate, HOAs. People don't know that HOA boards are subject to fair housing, but they are. and your HOA, like little property owners may be actually violating fair housing laws without knowing it. So I always in educating to small landlords, to HOAs, and making sure that people are aware of fair housing rules. That's important. If you're going to have a robust SB9 or ADU program, that's I also recommend putting a fact sheet about fair housing rights and responsibility, because now all of a sudden you have a lot of individual property owners who have never been landlords before becoming landlords in the future, that renting the ADUs and renting the SB9 units, and they need to know that they are subject to fair housing laws. And also that is one way to promote housing mobility, and also introducing housing opportunities in high resource areas, because now with the new fair housing requirement, the source of income protection, landlords, even individual property owners who's renting the ADU, cannot reject a housing choice voucher as the payment of rent. In the past, it's legal. In California, that says no housing choice voucher accepted. Since 2020, I believe that 2020 or 2021, that has become illegal in California to not accept housing choice vouchers. So I usually recommend including a fact sheet about fair housing and source of income protection in ADU application and SB9 application, so that you alert your property owners. We also talk about tenant protections. There are some interesting local preferences that are trying to protect, not protect, but as an anti-displacement strategy. So we can go into details. I have another one training that goes by meaningful actions by typology of jurisdictions, whether you're a large jurisdiction, whether you're a suburban jurisdiction, whether you're a rural jurisdiction, like what kind of meaningful actions may be appropriate. But tenant protection is something that is very important. Another thing to think about that I actually include in AFFH is not related to housing, but relating to stabilizing a neighborhood, especially if you are utilizing a lot of commercial properties into mixed use properties into providing mixed use or housing for your arena. You need to have some kind of business relocation assistance kind of program. You not need to, but it would be better, because you are potentially displacing small local businesses. And so how do you help them to relocate back into your community, in other parts of your community, so that you stabilize the employment situation, stabilize your business location, but also promote housing. So you try not to benefit one segment and then damaging your economic development segment. So I think linking those two together it would be also in AFFH actions. So there are a lot of different things that you can do, but that may be too much of a detail to do.
So it's really that simple, huh? One other question. I think this is going to have to close it out. We're right at the hour. Can you expand on the requirement to adopt an environmental justice element with the update to the housing element? Many smaller jurisdictions do not have an updated general plan with an EJ element.
I'm not a general plan expert, but the only thing that I know, actually I know a little bit more, but I don't want to say the wrong thing because I'm not a general plan. It's just certain communities, if you have I think if you have a disadvantaged communities if you have a disadvantaged communities, then you are required to update or have an EJ element if you update more than 2 elements at the same time.
Okay. Well, that really does it. We're a little bit past the hour. I want to thank our panelists again, and I want to thank everybody who dialed into this webinar, and we will see you the next time. So thank you, everyone. And once again, this will be posted on the website in about a week here.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Veronica. Nice to see you. Take care.